June 4, 1942, 10:22 in the morning, somewhere north of Midway Atoll in the Central Pacific, at an altitude of 14,000 feet, a 32-year-old Navy lieutenant named Richard Halsey Best is staring through the canopy of his Douglas Dauntless dive bomber at the ocean below. What he sees does not make sense. 31 aircraft from his own carrier are pouring into a dive on the wrong ship. Best is the commander of Bombing Squadron 6. He has trained his men for exactly this moment. The doctrine is clear. 2 squadrons approaching 2 targets split the attack. The trailing squadron takes the nearer target. The leading squadron takes the farther one. That is what the manual says. That is what every pilot in the squadron has rehearsed. And the Air Group commander, Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, has just violated it. McCluskey, who had taken command of the Air Group only weeks before and had never led a full dive bombing strike in combat, has sent the entire formation screaming toward the nearest carrier, a ship the Japanese call Kaga. Best watches 31 Dauntlesses commit to a single target and understands in the span of 2 heartbeats that the second carrier, the flagship of the entire Japanese striking force, is about to escape untouched. He does the only thing a man in his position can do. He pulls out of the dive, radios his 2 wingmen to follow, and turns alone toward the second ship. 3 aircraft, 3 pilots, 1,000-pound bomb apiece, aimed at a carrier that has just helped conquer a quarter of the globe. In about 90 seconds, Best will release his bomb at 2,000 feet, pull up hard, and watch it punch through the flight deck of the carrier Akagi, the ship from which the attack on Pearl Harbor was launched 6 months earlier. The bomb will detonate in the upper hangar deck among rows of fueled and armed aircraft. The explosion will set off a chain of secondary blasts that will burn for the next 19 hours and sink the most powerful aircraft carrier in the Imperial Japanese Navy. Best will not know for days what his single bomb has done. He will not know that in the same 6 minutes, 2 other Japanese carriers are also dying. He will not know that the war in the Pacific has just turned on a hinge that will never swing back. He will only know that he is coughing. Something is wrong with his oxygen system. Something caustic is in the air. By the time he lands back on the Enterprise, he will be coughing up blood. The fumes from a defective rebreather canister will activate a latent tuberculosis infection that will end his flying career forever. The best day of his professional life, and the last mission he will ever fly, will be the same day. But that is not where this story begins. This story begins in a windowless basement in Pearl Harbor, 3 weeks earlier, where a Navy commander in a bathrobe is trying to convince people in Washington that he has cracked the secret of where Japan will strike next. And the reason that basement matters, the reason this entire investigation turns on what happened inside it, is that the Battle of Midway was not won in the air above those carriers. It was won in a chain of individual human decisions, each one made by a single man acting on incomplete information and trusting his own judgment against the weight of every safe alternative. What Richard Best did in those 90 seconds over the Akagi, a lieutenant choosing to attack a fleet flagship with 2 wingmen because no one else was going to do it, was the last link in a chain that had started with a codebreaker, run through an intelligence officer, passed to an admiral, been handed to a task force commander, and flowed down to a dive bomber pilot who had been flying for 3 hours on a fuel gauge that was already in the red. Every link in that chain was a man deciding to act when the easier and safer choice was to wait. Every link was a man choosing to trust what he could see over what he had been told. And every link was forged in a country and a service that had, almost without realizing it, built a military culture where the man closest to the problem was expected to solve it, even if solving it meant overriding the plan, the doctrine, and the chain of command. To understand how the carriers were caught refueling planes on deck when those 6 minutes changed the war, you have to go back 3 weeks, 4,000 miles, and 30 feet underground. You have to start in the basement. In May of 1942, the United States Navy was losing the Pacific War. 6 months after Pearl Harbor, Japan controlled an empire stretching from the borders of India to the Marshall Islands, an arc of conquest larger than anything Napoleon or Hitler had achieved. The carrier Lexington had been sunk at the Battle of the Coral Sea. The carrier Yorktown had limped back to Pearl Harbor with a bomb hole in her flight deck and damage to her internal structure that the shipyard estimated would take 90 days to repair. That left the Pacific Fleet with 2 operational carriers, Enterprise and Hornet, against a Japanese navy that could put 10 carriers to sea. Those were the numbers, those were the odds, and into those odds walked a man who had spent 4 months sleeping on a cot in a basement and who smelled, by his own staff's private admission, like he had not bathed in a week. His name was Commander Joseph Rochefort. He ran Station Hypo, the Navy's signals intelligence unit at Pearl Harbor. The unit operated in the basement of the 14th Naval District Headquarters building, a room about the size of a pool hall, perpetually cold, perpetually dark, and perpetually thick with cigarette smoke. Rochefort's staff consisted of about 10 officers and 31 enlisted men, a mix of cryptanalysts, traffic analysts, and Japanese linguists who worked shifts that sometimes stretched to 36 hours without a break. Rochefort himself was famous for wearing a burgundy smoking jacket and carpet slippers in the basement because the air conditioning made the room too cold for standard uniforms. Military protocol was non-existent. Enlisted men wore dungarees. Nobody saluted. Rochefort's only rule was the mission. His job, as he described it in his own words, was to tell his commander what the enemy was going to do tomorrow. Rochefort was not the man who actually cracked the Japanese naval code. That work was done primarily by Lieutenant Commander Thomas Dyer, who led the cryptanalytic team. What Rochefort did was something harder to quantify and almost impossible to replace. He took fragments of partially decrypted messages, thousands of them, many of them garbled, most of them incomplete, and he assembled them into a picture. By early May of 1942, Hypo was receiving between 500 and 1,000 intercepts per day, and reading portions of roughly 60% of them. The picture Rochefort was assembling from those fragments said something that almost nobody in Washington believed. It said the Japanese were planning a massive naval offensive against a target they designated in code as AF. It said the attack would come in early June. It said the striking force would include 4 fleet carriers, and Rochefort believed, against the objections of his superiors in Washington, that AF was Midway. Washington disagreed. The Code Analysis section in the Navy Department, Station Negat, believed the target was elsewhere, possibly the Aleutian Islands, possibly the west coast of the United States, possibly even Hawaii again. The analysts in Washington thought Rochefort was wrong. They thought his team was reading too much into fragments. The bureaucratic pressure on Rochefort to change his assessment was enormous. He refused to change it. He had been reading Japanese naval traffic for months. He knew the patterns. He knew the call signs. He knew the operational tempo. And he knew, with the stubborn certainty of a man who had staked his career on a crossword puzzle he could not fully see, that AF was Midway. But knowing was not enough. He had to prove it. And the proof came from one of his staff officers, Lieutenant Commander Jasper Holmes, who proposed a ruse so simple it sounds almost like a joke. Holmes knew that Midway Island had no natural source of fresh water. The garrison depended entirely on a desalination plant. He suggested that Midway be instructed, via a secure undersea cable, to broadcast an unencrypted radio message reporting that the desalination plant had broken down and that the island was running short of fresh water. If the Japanese intercepted the broadcast and reported it, and if that report referred to the target as AF, then AF was Midway. Rochefort got Nimitz's approval. Midway sent the message. Within 48 hours, a Japanese intelligence report was intercepted. It said, in substance, that AF was reporting a water shortage. The trap had worked. AF was Midway. Even then, Washington was not fully convinced. But Admiral Chester Nimitz was. And Nimitz was the man who mattered. He had a relationship with his intelligence officer, Lieutenant Commander Edwin Layton, that was built on a simple principle. Nimitz received his intelligence directly from the man who produced it, unfiltered by committees and unedited by superiors. Layton, drawing on everything Rochefort's team had assembled, gave Nimitz a forecast that has become one of the most famous predictions in military history. He told Nimitz that the Japanese carriers would probably attack on the morning of June 4, from the northwest, on a bearing of 325 degrees. He said they could be expected at a distance of about 175 miles from Midway at around 0700 local time. When the Japanese carriers were sighted on the morning of June 4, Nimitz turned to Leighton and said that he had been only 5 minutes, 5 degrees, and 5 miles off. But there was a problem. Nimitz had the intelligence. He did not have the ships. 2 carriers against 4 was not a battle. It was a funeral. What Nimitz needed was Yorktown. And Yorktown, sitting in dry dock number 1 at Pearl Harbor, with a hole in her flight deck and structural damage below the waterline, was supposed to be out of the war for 3 months. Nimitz walked down to the dry dock, inspected the ship himself, and gave an order that the repair crews would remember for the rest of their lives. He said they had to have the ship back in 3 days. More than 1,400 dockyard workers swarmed aboard. They worked around the clock, welding steel plates over bomb damage, reinforcing structural frames, patching what could be patched, and ignoring what could not. 72 hours later, on May 30th, Yorktown steamed out of Pearl Harbor under her own power, patched together and held by welds that were still warm, heading for a battle that the men aboard her had been told almost nothing about. She was not fully repaired. She would never be fully repaired, but she was afloat, she could launch aircraft, and she gave Nimitz 3 carriers instead of 2. The man Nimitz chose to command the striking force from Enterprise and Hornet was not the man anyone expected. Vice Admiral William Halsey, the aggressive carrier commander who had led the early raids and the Doolittle mission, was in the hospital with a severe skin condition. He could barely stand. When Nimitz asked him to recommend a replacement, Halsey named his cruiser commander, Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance. Spruance was not an aviator. He had never commanded carriers in combat. He was a surface warfare officer, a quiet, precise, methodical man who was the temperamental opposite of the combative Halsey. But Halsey trusted him, and what Spruance brought to the battle, as it turned out, was the single quality that mattered more than flying experience or tactical aggression. He brought judgment. He knew when to act and when to wait. He knew when the odds favored risk and when they demanded caution. And on the morning of June 4, he made the decision that put the dive bombers over the Japanese carriers at the exact moment the Japanese were most vulnerable. Spruance launched early. His chief of staff, Captain Miles Browning, had calculated that if the American carriers launched at maximum range at around 0700, the strike would arrive over the Japanese fleet at approximately the moment Nagumo's carriers would be recovering their midway strike aircraft. The flight decks would be busy, the hangars would be full, the fuel lines would be active. It was a narrow window, and hitting it meant launching at a range that would push the Dauntlesses to the outer edge of their fuel capacity. Many of them might not make it back. Spruance accepted the risk. He ordered the launch. What Spruance could not know, and what no one on the American side could have predicted, was that a Japanese admiral named Chuichi Nagumo was about to make a series of decisions aboard the carrier Akagi that would turn the hangars of 4 carriers into floating ammunition dumps. To understand what Nagumo did, you have to understand what he was being asked to do. His orders from Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of Pearl Harbor and the commander of the combined fleet, gave him 2 missions that were fundamentally incompatible. He was to strike Midway Island with enough force to neutralize its air defenses before an invasion force arrived, and he was to hold a reserve strike force, armed with torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs, in case American warships appeared. The problem was that both missions required the same aircraft, and on the morning of June 4, Nagumo did not know whether American carriers were in the area. At about 0430, Nagumo launched 108 aircraft against Midway under Lieutenant Joichi Tomonaga. The strike hit the island, but did not destroy its air capacity. Tomonaga radioed back that a second strike was needed. At the same time, Midway-based aircraft, land-based bombers and torpedo planes began attacking the Japanese fleet. They scored no hits, but they kept Nagumo's attention fixed on the island threat. And then, at 0715, Nagumo made his first fateful decision. He ordered the reserve aircraft, the ones that had been armed with torpedoes for use against ships, to be rearmed with contact-fused bombs for a second strike on Midway. The order meant that ordnance crews had to go into the hangars, remove torpedoes from aircraft, and replace them with land attack bombs. It was a process that took time, and it created chaos below decks. Then the situation changed. A scout plane from the cruiser Tone, which had launched roughly 30 minutes late because of a catapult malfunction, reported sighting American surface ships to the northeast. The scout was a float plane flown by Petty Officer First Class Hiroshi Amari, and his transmissions that morning would shape the fate of the battle. His first report, sent at around 0728, said he could see what appeared to be 10 enemy surface ships at a distance of 240 miles from Midway. The report was vague. It gave a course and speed but did not specify whether carriers were among them. The message had to travel from Amari's aircraft to Tone's radio room and then by signal lamp to Akagi, which meant Nagumo did not receive it immediately. Nagumo, caught between two threats, hesitated. He wanted to know if the American force included carriers before committing his reserve. At about 0809, Amari reported further. 5 cruisers and 5 destroyers. No mention of a carrier. Nagumo continued the rearming. Minutes later, the scout reported again. This time the message said that the American force appeared to include a carrier bringing up the rear. Nagumo reversed himself. He ordered the rearming stopped, and the aircraft switched back to torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs for a naval strike. Historians have noted a bitter irony in the Tone Scout's late launch. Had Amari taken off on time and flown his prescribed search pattern, he would not have found the American fleet until much later, possibly too late for Nagumo to react at all. The delay that caused so much confusion may have actually given the Japanese their only chance to respond, a chance that Nagumo's indecision then squandered. The result was pandemonium in the hangars. Bombs that had just been loaded onto aircraft were being pulled off. Torpedoes that had just been removed were being hauled back. Because there was no time to return the ordnance to the magazines, the bombs and torpedoes were stacked wherever there was room, on the hangar floors, against the bulkheads, between the landing gear of parked aircraft. Fuel lines were active because the returning Midway strike needed to be refueled as soon as it landed. The hangars of 4 Japanese carriers were becoming rooms full of fuel vapor, loose explosives, and armed aircraft, all of it exposed and unsecured. This is what people mean when they say the carriers were refueling planes on deck. The traditional image, the one Mitsuo Fuchida painted in his famous post-war account, was of flight decks packed with fully armed aircraft about to launch when the American bombs arrived. That version has been challenged by modern historians, most notably Jonathan Parshall and Anthony Tully, in their landmark study of the battle. The flight decks were not packed. Most of the strike aircraft were still below in the hangars. What made the carriers vulnerable was not aircraft on the flight deck, it was the ammunition and fuel below. The rearming chaos had turned the hangar decks into fire traps. The loose ordnance would detonate when the bombs hit, and the aviation fuel would feed fires that no damage control team could contain. The danger was not above. The danger was below. While Nagumo wrestled with his ordnance decisions, the first American carrier aircraft were already in the air and flying toward him. What happened next was one of the most lopsided and tragic episodes of the entire Pacific War. It began with the torpedo bombers. Lieutenant Commander John Waldron was 41 years old, part Sioux, raised in South Dakota. He commanded Torpedo Squadron 8 from the carrier Hornet. On the morning of June 4, Waldron's 15 TBD Devastators launched as part of the Hornet Air Group under Commander Stanhope Ring. Ring led the group on a heading of roughly 265 degrees. Waldron believed the heading was wrong. He had studied the Japanese, he had read the intelligence, and he was convinced the enemy fleet was further to the south. He broke away from Ring and flew his own course. He found the Japanese fleet. Ring did not. Ring's fighters and dive bombers flew in the wrong direction, never found the enemy, and either returned to the ship or ditched at sea in what history calls the flight to nowhere. Waldron had disobeyed his air group commander and flown alone, without fighter escort, directly to the target. What he found when he got there was 4 carriers surrounded by battleships, cruisers, and destroyers, with dozens of Zero fighters swarming above them. Waldron attacked anyway. He took his 15 slow, obsolete torpedo planes straight at the Japanese fleet at wave-top height, through a wall of anti-aircraft fire and a swarm of the best fighter aircraft in the Pacific. The Zeros tore Torpedo 8 apart. One by one, the devastators were hit, caught fire, cartwheeled into the sea. The torpedoes that were launched either missed or failed to detonate because the Mark 13 torpedo was a notoriously defective weapon. Within minutes, all 15 aircraft were gone. Of the 30 men aboard them, 29 were dead. The sole survivor was Ensign George Gay, who launched his torpedo, was shot down, and spent the next 30 hours floating in the ocean, hiding under his seat cushion to avoid being strafed, watching the battle unfold around him. He was picked up the next day by a patrol flying boat. Waldron had told his men before the mission that if only one plane was left, he wanted that man to go in and get a hit. Every man in the squadron went in. None of them got a hit. And all of them, except George Gay, died trying. Then Waldron's plane hit the water, and he was gone. Torpedo 8 was not the only squadron to die that morning. Torpedo Squadron 6 from Enterprise, under Lieutenant Commander Eugene Lindsay, attacked next. Lindsay lost 10 of his 14 aircraft. He was killed. Torpedo Squadron 3 from Yorktown, under Lieutenant Commander Lance Massey, attacked after that with a small fighter escort of 6 Wildcats, led by Lieutenant Commander John Thatch. Thatch was one of the finest fighter pilots in the Navy, and during this engagement, he used a tactic he had been developing for months to counter the Zero's superior maneuverability. It was called the Thack Weave, 2 fighters flying in a weaving pattern so that each one could cover the other's tail. It was the first time the tactic had been used in combat, and Thack shot down several Zeros despite being outnumbered by more than 3 to 1. But the Zeros were too many. Massey lost 10 of his 12 aircraft. He was killed. Thack's wingman, Ensign Robert Dibb, survived. Another of his pilots, Ensign Edgar Bassett, did not. In total, the 3 torpedo squadrons launched 41 aircraft. Only 6 returned. They scored no hits. 35 planes, and most of their crews were destroyed for nothing. For nothing. That is what it looked like. That is what a Japanese officer standing on the bridge of any of those 4 carriers would have concluded at approximately 10:15 that morning. The American torpedo attacks had been beaten off with no damage to any Japanese ship. The carriers were intact. The Zeros had swept the sky clean. The fighter pilots were refueling and rearming on the flight decks. Nagumo's staff was preparing to launch the strike against the American carriers as soon as the last of the returning Midway aircraft were recovered and the reserve planes were spotted on deck. There was a separate detachment from Torpedo 8 that history rarely mentions. 6 brand-new TBF Avenger torpedo bombers, the replacement aircraft that were supposed to make the obsolete Devastator irrelevant, had flown from Midway itself rather than from the Hornet. 5 of the 6 were shot down. The sole survivor, piloted by Ensign Albert Ernest, made it back to Midway on one wheel with a dead gunner and a wounded radio man. The Avenger, on its very first day of combat, had fared no better than the aircraft it was designed to replace. The battle appeared to be over before it had begun. But the torpedo pilots had done something that none of them lived to understand. They had pulled the Zero Combat Air Patrol down to sea level. Every Japanese fighter in the sky had descended to chase the slow, low-flying torpedo bombers. The Zeros were at wave-top height, low on fuel, low on ammunition, scattered across miles of ocean, and completely out of position. 14,000 feet above them, the sky was empty. It was into that empty sky that Wade McCluskey arrived with 31 dive bombers from Enterprise, and it was into that same sky, from a different bearing at almost the same moment that Lieutenant Commander Max Leslie arrived with 17 dive bombers from Yorktown. The timing was not planned. It was not coordinated. The 2 groups did not know the other was there. McCluskey had been searching for the Japanese fleet for over 2 hours, had reached his expected intercept point, found nothing, and made the decision that Admiral Nimitz would later say decided the fate of the battle. He kept searching. He flew southwest, then northwest, burning fuel he could not afford to burn, looking for ships he could not find, refusing to turn back, because turning back meant the mission had failed and the fleet carriers of Japan would remain untouched. Then he spotted a white line on the blue ocean below. A wake, a single ship moving at high speed toward the northeast. It was the destroyer Arashi, racing to rejoin the Japanese fleet, after having stayed behind to depth charge the American submarine Nautilus. McCluskey did not know any of that. He only knew that a destroyer running at full speed in the open ocean was running towards something. He followed the wake. 20 minutes later, he saw the carriers. What happened in the next 6 minutes changed the Pacific War. McCluskey pushed over into his dive. His 31 Dauntlesses went down on the nearest carrier, Kaga. Lieutenant Earl Gallagher, the commander of Scouting 6, was the first pilot to score a direct hit. Gallagher had been at Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941. He had seen the destruction of the battleship Arizona with his own eyes. Now, 6 months later, he was diving on a Japanese carrier. At least 4 bombs struck Kaga. One of them hit the bridge and killed Captain Jisaku Okada and most of his senior officers. The ship was engulfed in fire within minutes. She burned until evening and was scuttled by her own escorts. 811 of her crew died. Richard Best, watching McCluskey's entire formation pour onto Kaga, pulled out of the attack run, took his 2 wingmen, and turned toward Akagi. He later described the moment. He was at full throttle, nose down, moving too fast to open his dive flaps. He hauled back on the stick, climbed to 14,000 feet, slowed enough to deploy the flaps, and rolled into a 70-degree dive aimed at the center of the flagship of the Japanese Combined Fleet striking force. There was no anti-aircraft fire. There was no sign the ship had detected him. The Zeros were all at sea level, Best released at 2,000 feet. His 1,000-pound bomb punched through the flight deck near the amidships elevator and detonated in the upper hangar among armed and fueled aircraft. A near miss from one of his wingmen landed close alongside and jammed the ship's rudder. Akagi was finished. The fires spread to the torpedo storage, to the bomb magazine, to the fuel bunkers. Admiral Nagumo refused at first to leave his flagship. His chief of staff, Rear Admiral Ryunosuke Kusaka, had to convince him that commanding a fleet from a burning ship with no working radio was impossible. Nagumo transferred his flag to the light cruiser Nagara. Akagi burned through the night and was scuttled the following morning. 267 of her crew died. At almost the same moment, Best was diving on Akagi. Max Leslie's Yorktown bombers were falling on the carrier Soryu from a different angle. Leslie himself had no bomb. A faulty electrical arming switch had accidentally released it during the flight in. He dove anyway, strafing the flight deck with his machine guns to suppress anti-aircraft fire for the pilots behind him. His guns jammed. He pulled out and watched his squadron deliver 3 direct hits along the length of Soryu's flight deck. The bombs penetrated to the hangar deck, which was packed with aircraft that had just returned from the Midway strike and were being refueled and rearmed. Soryu was abandoned within 20 minutes. Her captain, Yanagimoto, refused to leave. He chose to go down with his ship. 711 of the crew died with him. In approximately 6 minutes, 3 of the 4 carriers of the most powerful naval striking force ever assembled had been reduced to burning hulks. The 4th carrier, Hiryu, had been obscured by weather and was not attacked in the initial strike. She would launch 2 counterstrikes against Yorktown that afternoon, scoring 3 bomb hits and 2 torpedo hits that would eventually sink the American carrier. But Hiryu's reprieve was short. That afternoon, a Yorktown scout plane found her. Enterprise launched 24 dive bombers under Gallagher, including survivors from Yorktown's own squadron, who had nowhere else to land. They scored 4 direct hits. Hiryu burned through the night. Her commander, Rear Admiral Tamon Yamaguchi, widely considered the most gifted carrier admiral in the Japanese Navy, chose to go down with his ship alongside his captain. 392 of the crew died. 4 carriers, the Akagi, the Kaga, the Soryu, and the Hiryu, the ships that had attacked Pearl Harbor, that had raided Darwin, that had swept through the Indian Ocean, that had projected Japanese power across a quarter of the Earth's surface. All 4 were on the bottom of the Pacific by the morning of June 5th. Japan lost 3,057 men in the battle. The United States lost the carrier Yorktown, the destroyer Hammond, and 307 men. Yorktown, despite the damage from Hiryu's strikes, had refused to die easily. Damage control parties had fought her fires and repaired her list so effectively that the Japanese pilots who returned for the second strike believed they were attacking a different, undamaged carrier. Salvage efforts were underway, and she was being towed by the fleet tug Vireo when on June 6th, the Japanese submarine I-168 slipped through the destroyer screen and fired a spread of torpedoes. 2 struck Yorktown, a third hit the destroyer Hamon alongside, which sank in 4 minutes. Yorktown, the ship that 1,400 dockyard workers had repaired in 72 hours, that had launched the dive bombers that destroyed Soryu, finally capsized and sank on the morning of June 7th. The Japanese concealed the defeat entirely. Wounded survivors of the sunken carriers were quarantined in naval hospitals. Crews were transferred quietly to new assignments. No public announcement was made. Most of the Japanese military, let alone the Japanese public, did not learn the truth about Midway until long after the war. The loss was not just 4 ships and 3,000 men. It was the organizational core of the Kido Butai, the First Air Fleet, the most formidable concentration of naval air power ever assembled. Modern historians have noted that the pilot losses, roughly 110 carrier aircrew killed, were painful but not crippling in isolation. Japan had approximately 2,000 carrier-qualified pilots at the start of the war. The graver loss, the one that could never be replaced, was the trained flight deck crews, the mechanics, the armorers, the plane handlers, and the men who knew how to operate a carrier at combat tempo. That institutional knowledge went to the bottom with the ships. Japan would build new carriers. She would train new pilots. But she would never rebuild the machine that made the Kido Butai what it was. There was another asymmetry that Midway accelerated. The United States rotated its combat veterans home to train new pilots. John Thatch, who had developed the Thatch weave in the skies above the torpedo squadrons that morning, was one of those men. He went home, taught the weave to hundreds of new fighter pilots, and multiplied his own skill across the entire fleet. Japan did not rotate its veterans. It kept them in combat until attrition destroyed them. Every experienced Japanese pilot lost at Midway, and in the grinding battles that followed in the Solomons and the Central Pacific, was a loss that rippled forward through the rest of the war. By 1944, the replacement pilots Japan was sending to its carriers had a fraction of the flying hours their predecessors had accumulated, and the gap widened with every month. Midway did not end the war, but it ended the period of the war in which Japan could fight on equal terms. The strategic initiative in the Pacific passed from Japan to the United States and never returned. Every like on this video is a small act of remembrance for the men who made that possible. The ones who dove into anti-aircraft fire at 70 degrees, and the ones who flew torpedo planes they knew were obsolete against fighters they knew were superior. It costs nothing. It keeps their names visible, and that matters more than any algorithm. There is a question that runs through every account of Midway, asked by historians and by the men who fought it, and it is the question this investigation has to answer. Why did the Japanese lose? They had more carriers, they had more aircraft, they had more experienced pilots, they had the finest carrier striking force in the world, a force that had not lost a single ship in 6 months of continuous offensive operations. How did 3 American carriers, one of them held together with emergency welds, crewed by pilots who had never fought a fleet carrier battle, defeat the force that had conquered the Pacific? The answer most people know is luck. McCluskey was lucky to spot the Arashi. The torpedo squadrons were lucky in the sense that their sacrifice happened to drag the Zeros down at exactly the right moment. The dive bombers were lucky to arrive at the same time from different directions without coordination. There is luck in the story. There is always luck in war. But luck is not the answer. The answer is a chain of decisions, each one made by a single human being under pressure, each one choosing action over safety, each one trusting his own judgment over the received wisdom of the chain above him. Start with Rochefort in the basement. He was told by Washington that his analysis was wrong. He was told that AF was not Midway. He was warned, in terms that a career officer understood perfectly, that insisting on his assessment against the judgment of his superiors was professionally dangerous. He insisted anyway. He devised the water ruse. He proved the target. Without Rochefort, Nimitz does not know where the Japanese are going. Without Nimitz knowing, there is no ambush. Without the ambush, the American carriers are not in position. The battle does not happen. Rochefort's reward for being right was to be transferred out of intelligence after the battle, reassigned to command a floating dry dock, and denied the medal Nimitz recommended him for. The men who had been wrong took credit for the work of the man who had been right. Rochefort never spoke publicly about the injustice. He died in 1976. His Distinguished Service Medal was awarded posthumously by President Reagan in 1986, 10 years after his death. Move to Leighton. His forecast, the bearing, the distance, the time, was the product of months of collaboration with Rochefort and careful analysis of partial intelligence. He delivered it to Nimitz without hedging, without qualifiers, without the bureaucratic cushioning that protects an intelligence officer who turns out to be wrong. He staked his professional reputation on a prediction built from fragments of intercepted code. He was right within 5 minutes, 5 degrees, and 5 miles. Move to Nimitz. He was being told by Washington to prepare for an attack on the Aleutians, or possibly the West Coast. His own intelligence team was telling him Midway. He chose to believe the men who were closest to the raw data, the men in the basement, over the men who outranked them. He committed his entire available carrier force, including a ship that by rights should still have been in dry dock, to a battle that, if his intelligence was wrong, would leave the Pacific Fleet with no carriers at all. That is not caution, that is not calculation. That is a commander deciding to trust the man who has spent 4 months in a windowless room reading Japanese message traffic over the institutional judgment of the Navy Department. Move to Spruance. He launched early, at extreme range, knowing that many of his aircraft might not have enough fuel to return. He did it because the tactical logic demanded it. If he waited for a safer range, the Japanese would have their strike aircraft spotted, armed, and in the air before his bombers arrived. The window Browning had calculated, the window when the flight decks would be occupied with recovering and rearming aircraft, was narrow, and it was specific. Spruance understood that being too late by 30 minutes was the same as not being there at all. He accepted the fuel risk. He launched. Move to Waldron. He was a squadron commander aboard Hornet, a subordinate officer in an air group led by Commander Stanhope Ring. Ring flew the wrong heading. Waldron knew it was wrong. He broke formation, disobeyed his air group commander, and flew his 15 obsolete torpedo planes on his own course to the Japanese fleet. Without fighter escort, without dive bomber support, without any realistic chance that his torpedoes would work even if he got close enough to drop them. He did it because he believed the target was there, and because reaching the target was his mission. He was killed. His entire squadron was destroyed, and his attack, along with the 2 torpedo squadron attacks that followed, was the act that pulled the Zeros out of position and opened the sky for the dive bombers. Move to McCluskey. He reached the intercept point and found empty ocean. His fuel gauges were dropping toward the point of no return. Doctrine and common sense both said the same thing. Turn back. Report the failure. Live to fly another mission. He did not turn back. He kept searching. He flew southwest first, reasoning that there was a slim chance the Japanese approach track was farther west than anticipated. Then he turned northwest. He spotted a single white wake on the blue water below, a destroyer running at flank speed toward the northeast. It was the Arashi, returning to the fleet after depth charging the submarine Nautilus. McCluskey did not guess. He later insisted there was no guesswork involved. He knew the Japanese had not passed him to the south because the Midway patrol planes would have reported them. He knew they had to be to the north. He followed the wake, and 20 minutes later, he was over the Kido Butai. When he landed back on Enterprise that afternoon, his Dauntless had 55 bullet holes in it and roughly 5 gallons of fuel remaining. Admiral Nimitz later said that McCluskey's decision to continue the search decided the fate of the carrier task force and the forces at Midway. And finally, move to Best. The formation is committed to the wrong target. 31 aircraft are diving on 1 carrier. The flagship, the most important ship in the Japanese fleet, is about to be left untouched. Best, a lieutenant, does not have time to radio anyone. He does not have time to consult anyone. He has the span of a single breath to recognize that the doctrine has been violated, to understand that no one else is going to correct the error, and to take 3 aircraft against a ship that is defended by the most formidable anti-aircraft screen in the Pacific. He was born in Bayonne, New Jersey, in 1910. He graduated from Annapolis in 1932. He had earned his wings in 1935. He was not a strategist. He was not an admiral. He was a squadron commander in a dive bomber, making a decision in the time it takes to exhale, and the decision he made sank the flagship of the Japanese striking force. That is the chain. Rochefort to Leighton, to Nimitz, to Spruance, to Waldron, to McCluskey, to Best. 7 men, 7 decisions. Every one of them made under uncertainty, made against institutional pressure or physical danger, or both. Made by a man trusting his own reading of the situation over the safer option of waiting for someone above him to decide. It is a chain that could have broken at any link. If Rochefort defers to Washington, Nimitz does not know the target. If Nimitz hedges his commitment, the carriers are not in position. If Spruance waits for a safer range, the strike arrives too late. If Waldron follows Ring, the Zeros are never pulled down. If McCluskey turns back, the carriers are never found. If Best follows McCluskey onto Kaga, Akagi survives to launch her strike. Every link held. Every man chose to act. Now compare what was happening on the Japanese side. Admiral Nagumo, aboard Akagi, faced a genuine tactical dilemma that morning, and his handling of it reveals something important about the system he was operating in. His orders from Yamamoto gave him 2 incompatible missions: strike Midway, reserve aircraft for naval targets. The orders did not tell him how to reconcile the two if both demands arrived simultaneously, and when both demands arrived simultaneously, Nagumo froze. He ordered the rearming from torpedoes to bombs. Then he reversed the order back to torpedoes. Then the returning Midway strike needed to be recovered, which occupied the flight decks. The result was that Nagumo's strike force spent the critical hours of the morning shuffling ordnance back and forth in the hangars, unable to commit to either mission, while American aircraft attacked from every direction. Nagumo was not an incompetent officer. He had commanded the Pearl Harbor strike. He had led the Indian Ocean raid. He was experienced, capable, and brave, but he was operating in a command system that concentrated decision-making authority at the top and punished independent judgment from below. Yamamoto, the overall commander, was 800 miles away on the battleship Yamato, maintaining radio silence. He had intelligence from his own signals unit suggesting that American carriers might be in the area. He did not relay it to Nagumo. Nagumo did not know what Yamamoto knew, and Nagumo's subordinates, the captains and air officers on the 4 carriers, did not challenge Nagumo's decisions, even when those decisions were visibly incoherent. The system did not encourage them to. Commander Minoru Genda, the brilliant air tactician who had planned the Pearl Harbor strike, was aboard Akagi but sick with pneumonia. His influence was diminished at the moment it was most needed. Captain Mitsuo Fuchida, who had led the Pearl Harbor attack, was also aboard, recovering from an emergency appendectomy, unable to fly, watching events unfold from the bridge. The 2 men who best understood carrier aviation in the entire Japanese Navy were both on the flagship and both sidelined. No one below them stepped up to fill the gap. The system did not produce men who stepped up. Contrast that with what was happening on the American side. Waldron, a lieutenant commander, disobeyed his air group commander and flew his own course. McCluskey, a lieutenant commander, overrode doctrine and tactical caution to keep searching. Best, a lieutenant, overrode his air group commander's target selection in the middle of a combat dive. These were not acts of rebellion. They were acts of initiative by men who had been raised in a culture, both military and civilian, that expected the man closest to the situation to make the call. The American system in 1942 was messy, improvised, and often chaotic. The Hornet Air Group flew the wrong direction. The torpedo planes attacked without fighter cover. The dive bombers arrived at the target by accident as much as by design. But the men in the cockpits, when the moment arrived, made decisions. The Japanese system was elegant, precise, and doctrinally coherent. It also paralyzed the men who needed to act. After the war, when Japanese officers were interrogated as part of the United States Strategic Bombing Survey, their testimony was remarkably candid. Captain Taijiro Aoki, the commanding officer of Akagi, described the moment the bombs hit. He said the planes were loaded up with bombs inside the hangar and caught fire. His testimony confirmed what modern historians have concluded. The strike aircraft were below, not on deck. The danger was the unsecured ordnance and the active fuel lines in the hangars. Captain Susumu Kawaguchi, the air officer of Hiryu, was asked about the dive bomber attack that destroyed his ship. He said the floor of the elevator flopped against the bridge. When asked about the prospects of the war, he said something that speaks across the decades. He said they all thought that if it was a long war, the Navy would be finished, and they thought it would be a long war. Captain Ohara, the executive officer of Soryu, described the 3 bomb hits that killed his ship. He said the bombs went through the flight deck and exploded in the lower hangar among planes that had returned from Midway and were refueled and rearmed. When these officers were asked which form of attack they feared most, they all gave the same answer: dive bombers. They said you could not dodge a dive bomber. There is one more man I want you to know about. His name was Bruno Guido. He was an aviation machinist's mate first class, an enlisted man, a rear-seat gunner in a Dauntless dive bomber. In February of 1942, 4 months before Midway, a Japanese twin-engine bomber attempted a suicide dive into the Enterprise. Guido, who was not on duty, ran across the flight deck, jumped into the rear seat of a parked Dauntless, and opened fire on the incoming bomber. He shot it down. Admiral Halsey promoted him on the spot. At Midway, Guido flew as rear gunner for Ensign Franco Flaherty. They dove on Kaga. Their aircraft was hit or ran out of fuel, and they ditched in the ocean. They were picked up by the Japanese destroyer Makigumo. They were interrogated. And then, sometime around June 15th, they were murdered. Their captors tied weights to their bodies and threw them into the sea. Their fate was not known until after the war. Guido was not an officer. He was not a pilot. He was a mechanic who had been trained to shoot a .30 caliber machine gun from the back seat of a dive bomber. And when a bomber came at his ship, he did not wait for authorization. He ran across the deck and got into a plane that was not his and shot the bomber down. Nobody told him to do it. Nobody could have told him to do it. He just moved. He saw the situation and he acted. And at Midway, he climbed into the back seat of O'Flaherty's plane and flew into the most consequential air battle in naval history, and he did not come home. There is also Lieutenant Junior Grade Norman Kleiss of Scouting 6. Kleiss is the only dive bomber pilot confirmed to have scored hits on 3 different Japanese ships during the battle. He hit Kaga in the morning strike. He hit Hiryu in the afternoon strike. The next day, he hit the heavy cruiser Mikuma. He flew multiple combat missions in a single day, returning to a pitching carrier deck each time, rearming, refueling, and going back out. He survived the war and lived to be 100, dying in 2016. He was awarded the Navy Cross. And there was Lieutenant Joichi Tomonaga on the Japanese side. Tomonaga had led the morning strike on Midway. His aircraft had been damaged over the island, and its fuel tank was holed. When Hiryu's commander ordered a torpedo strike against the American carriers that afternoon, Tomonaga volunteered to lead it. His junior pilots begged him to take one of their undamaged planes. He refused. He climbed into an aircraft that he knew did not have enough fuel to get him home, led 10 torpedo bombers against Yorktown, pressed his attack through the anti-aircraft fire, and did not return. He was 31 years old. Courage was not an American monopoly. The men on both sides of that battle flew into fire, knowing what fire would do to them. The difference was not bravery. The difference was the system behind the bravery. The American system, imperfect and improvised, permitted a codebreaker to override Washington, an admiral to gamble on fragmentary intelligence, a task force commander to launch at extreme range, a squadron commander to disobey his air group leader, and a lieutenant to redirect his attack in the middle of a dive. The Japanese system, elegant and proven, did not permit a flag officer to act without orders from a commander who was maintaining radio silence 800 miles away, did not permit junior officers to challenge a rearming decision they could see was creating chaos, and did not produce a mechanism for resolving conflicting priorities when the man at the top was paralyzed by uncertainty. The 6 minutes over the Kido Butai were not a miracle. They were the product of a chain of human decisions that started in a basement and ended in a cockpit. each one made by a man who decided that the situation in front of him required action and that the person who had to take that action was him. The luck was real, the timing was extraordinary. But luck and timing only mattered because 7 men in sequence chose to act when every institutional incentive told them to wait. If your father or grandfather or any member of your family served in the Pacific Theater, in any branch, on any ship or island or airfield, I would consider it a privilege to read their story in the comments. What unit? Where did they serve? What do you remember them saying about it? Those details are the real archive of what happened. They deserve to be written down before the people who carry them are gone. So here is the answer to the question this investigation set out to resolve. How the carriers were caught refueling planes on deck when 6 minutes changed the war. They were caught because one man in a basement cracked a code, because another man took that code and made a prediction so precise it was off by 5 minutes, 5 degrees, and 5 miles, because an admiral trusted the prediction over the bureaucracy above him, because a task force commander launched at a range that might have stranded his pilots, because a squadron commander disobeyed orders and flew to his death to pull the enemy fighters out of position, because a dive bomber leader kept searching when every instrument told him to turn back, and because a lieutenant from New Jersey, flying with 2 wingmen against the most powerful carrier in the Japanese fleet, made a decision in the time it takes to exhale that sank the ship from which the attack on Pearl Harbor had been launched 6 months before. None of them had the full picture. None of them knew what the others were doing. None of them understood, in the moment, that the decision they were making was the one the entire battle would turn on. They only knew what was in front of them, and they acted. Richard Best landed back on Enterprise coughing blood. The sodium hydroxide fumes from his defective oxygen rebreather had activated a latent tuberculosis infection. He was hospitalized at Pearl Harbor 20 days later. He spent 32 months in treatment. He was medically retired from the Navy in 1944 at the age of 34. The best day of his career and the day his career ended were the same morning. He never flew again. He died on October 28, 2001, at 91 years old. He was buried at Arlington National Cemetery. His grandson later said that Best rarely spoke about Midway. When he did, he spoke about the men who did not come back. Waldron is dead. Lindsay is dead. Massey is dead. Guido was murdered at sea. O'Flaherty was murdered beside him. 29 men from Torpedo 8 are at the bottom of the Pacific. Fuchida survived the war and became a Christian evangelist. Nagumo commanded forces at Saipan in 1944 and took his own life when the island fell. Rochefort commanded a floating dry dock and died without recognition. Nimitz said Rochefort should have received the highest intelligence award the Navy could give. The men who had been wrong ensured that he did not. The carriers were caught with their hangars full of loose ordnance and active fuel lines because one admiral could not decide which mission to prioritize, and the system around him did not produce a subordinate who would force the decision. The American dive bombers arrived at the exact moment of maximum vulnerability because a chain of 7 men, none of whom knew the full picture, each made the right call at the right time for the right reason. That is not luck. That is not a miracle. That is what happens when a system trusts the men at the bottom of the chain as much as the men at the top. The 6 minutes over the Kido Butai on the morning of June 4, 1942, were the most consequential 6 minutes in the history of naval warfare. They ended Japanese offensive power in the Pacific. They began the long road to Tokyo, and they were decided not by fleets, or by strategies, or by war plans written in headquarters, but by individual men in individual cockpits, making individual decisions under individual pressure, each one choosing to act. If this investigation gave you something to think about, subscribe for the next chapter. These stories are about the men who fought the war, not the paragraphs in the manuals or the arrows on the maps. They are about the moments when a single person looked at a situation and decided that the someone who had to do something about it was them, and they deserve to be told with the names, the details and the facts intact, because the men who lived them earned at least that much.